On March 12, 1987, somewhere in the industrial outskirts of Zhukovsky, approximately 40 kilometers southeast of Moscow, a fire broke out inside Hangar 19 at a restricted airfield that officially didn't exist on any Soviet aviation maps. 5 men died that night. Their names were never published. Their families were told they perished in an industrial accident, which was true. But the nature of that accident, the project they were working on, and the reason they were in that hangar in the first place would remain classified for decades, buried under layers of Cold War secrecy that even the fall of the Soviet Union couldn't fully penetrate. The fire was contained by morning. Military firefighters who responded were debriefed, their reports confiscated, and within 72 hours, most of them were reassigned to posts hundreds of kilometers away. The hangar was sealed. Armed guards were posted at every entrance, and inside, partially constructed and now smoke-damaged, sat something that should not have existed. A full-scale mock-up of the American VC-25, the aircraft that would become the most famous presidential transport in the world, the plane known to everyone simply as Air Force One. This is the story of how Soviet intelligence tried to steal the future of American presidential aviation, how they failed, and how the evidence of that failure may have been deliberately erased in a single night nearly 2 decades later. To understand what happened in that hangar, you have to go back to 1981, when the United States Air Force began seriously considering a replacement for the aging VC-137 aircraft that had served as Air Force One since the Kennedy administration. By the early 1980s, those planes, modified Boeing 707s, were decades old, and the Air Force wanted something bigger, more capable, and more secure. In 1985, they announced their decision. They would purchase 2 Boeing 747-200B aircraft and transform them into flying fortresses, mobile command centers that could keep a president safe and connected even in the event of nuclear war. The program was designated VC-25. It represented the cutting edge of aerospace engineering, communications technology, and defensive systems. These weren't just luxury airliners with a presidential seal. They were being designed to survive electromagnetic pulses, resist missile attacks, refuel in mid-air, and maintain secure communications with military commanders anywhere on Earth. The specifications were highly classified, the modifications were extensive, and the Soviets wanted to know everything about them. This was the height of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was president. Tensions between Washington and Moscow were as high as they'd been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union was struggling economically, technologically falling behind, and desperate for any advantage they could find. Intelligence gathering wasn't just a priority, it was an obsession. Every American military program was a target, and the VC-25 program, because it involved the safety and mobility of the American president himself, was a particularly valuable one. Soviet intelligence services, primarily the KGB and GRU, began collecting information on the VC-25 program almost immediately after the Air Force announced the contract with Boeing. The operation involved multiple branches, multiple methods, and stretched across several years. They had human sources, people inside Boeing's Seattle facilities, subcontractors who worked on specialized components, low-level employees who had access to blueprints or technical specifications. None of these sources had complete access to the program. That would have been impossible given the security surrounding it. But each one provided fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle. According to former intelligence officers who spoke anonymously in later years, the Soviets were receiving what they called drips and drabs, bits of technical data, partial blueprints, vague descriptions of systems, and modifications. One source might report the dimensions of a communications array. Another might provide details about fuel capacity. A third might describe the layout of a particular cabin or the specifications for electromagnetic shielding. None of it was complete, none of it was verified, and crucially, much of it was contradictory. American counterintelligence was aware that the Soviets were trying to penetrate the VC-25 program. They didn't know the full extent of it, they never do, but they knew enough to implement aggressive security measures. Background checks were intensive. Access was compartmentalized. And in some cases, according to unconfirmed reports, deliberate disinformation was fed to suspected sources, false specifications designed to confuse or mislead anyone trying to reconstruct the aircraft's true capabilities. But the Soviets kept collecting. By late 1985, they had accumulated hundreds of reports, technical documents, photographs, and intercepted communications related to the VC-25 program. The question was what to do with all of it. Simply filing the intelligence away wasn't enough. The Kremlin wanted actionable insights. They wanted to understand the aircraft's vulnerabilities. They wanted to know if it could be tracked, intercepted, or disabled. And some within Soviet military intelligence believed the only way to truly understand the VC-25 was to build one themselves. The decision to construct a physical mock-up of the VC-25 was made sometime in early 1986, likely in January or February, though the exact date remains unclear. It wasn't a mainstream project. It wasn't approved through normal channels or funded through standard military budgets. Instead, it was a black program, organized by a small group within the GRU's Technical Intelligence Division and supported by elements of the KGB's Science and Technology Directorate. The logic, at least on paper, was sound. The Soviets had done this before, with other American military systems. During the 1970s, they had constructed mock-ups of American radar installations and missile systems to test countermeasures and train personnel. The idea was that if you could physically reconstruct something, even imperfectly, you could study it in ways that blueprints and reports couldn't provide. You could test electronic systems against it. You could simulate attacks on it. You could train pilots and special forces to operate around it or against it. But the VC-25 was not a radar dish or a missile battery. It was a massive, complex aircraft with thousands of integrated systems, many of which were classified and most of which the Soviets had only fragmentary information about. Building even a partial mock-up would require significant resources, skilled labor, and above all, secrecy. If the Americans found out the Soviets were attempting to reconstruct their presidential aircraft, it would be an intelligence disaster that could lead to a massive mole hunt and the loss of whatever sources the Soviets still had inside the program. Nevertheless, the decision was made. A remote airfield near Zhukovsky was selected. The site had been used for experimental aviation projects before. It had the infrastructure, the security, and the isolation necessary for something like this. Hangar 19, one of the largest structures on the field, was cleared out, reinforced, and placed under military guard. A team of engineers, aviation specialists, and intelligence analysts was assembled. Most of them were told they were working on a training simulator. Only a handful knew the true purpose of the project. Work began in March 1986. The team started with the basic airframe, using the dimensions and structural data they had collected to build a skeleton that approximated the VC-25's fuselage. They weren't trying to make it fly. This wasn't a functional aircraft. It was a shell, a three-dimensional model that could be used for tactical analysis and training. But even that limited goal proved extraordinarily difficult. The intelligence they were working from was inconsistent. Different reports gave different measurements. Some specifications seemed to contradict others. The engineers would build a section based on one set of documents, only to receive new intelligence suggesting that section was wrong and needed to be rebuilt. Materials were a problem too. Soviet manufacturing standards didn't always align with American ones, and certain components described in the intelligence simply didn't have direct Soviet equivalents. The work was slow, frustrating, and dangerous. Aviation construction, even non-flying mock-ups, involves heavy machinery, welding, electrical systems, and volatile materials. The hangar was crowded, poorly ventilated, and operating under intense secrecy, which meant shortcuts were taken, safety protocols were relaxed, and problems that should have been addressed were ignored in the rush to make progress. By early autumn, they had constructed roughly 40% of the fuselage. It was recognizable as an aircraft, at least in silhouette, but it was incomplete, unstable, and riddled with gaps where the team simply didn't have the information needed to continue. Morale was low. The engineers were exhausted, and increasingly, there were doubts about whether the project could ever be completed, or whether it was even worth completing, given the questionable quality of the intelligence they were working from. Then, on the night of March 12, 1987, just over a year after the project began, everything fell apart. It started sometime after 11 p.m. The exact cause was never officially determined, or at least never officially disclosed, but the most likely explanation, based on witness accounts and patterns of burn damage, was an electrical fault in one of the welding stations near the rear section of the mock-up. Sparks ignited insulation material, which spread to fuel residue, which ignited solvents and lubricants stored improperly nearby. Within minutes, the fire was out of control. The hangar's ventilation system, inadequate to begin with, turned the building into a chimney, funneling heat and smoke upward and outward, accelerating the blaze. Workers inside scrambled to evacuate, but the smoke was thick, disorienting, and toxic. The exits, restricted for security reasons, became bottlenecks. Some men made it out, others didn't. 5 workers died, 3 from smoke inhalation, 2 from burns. Their bodies were recovered after the fire was contained hours later when military firefighters finally gained access to the interior. The mock-up itself was heavily damaged, entire sections consumed by the fire, metal warped and twisted. Whatever electronics had been installed, destroyed beyond recovery. The incident was classified immediately. Families of the deceased were notified, but given only vague explanations. Official reports listed the deaths as industrial accidents at a military facility, nothing more. No public announcement was made. No investigation results were published. The hangar was sealed again, this time indefinitely, and the project, already struggling, was effectively dead. In the months following the fire, there was discussion within Soviet intelligence about whether to continue the project. Some argued that the work could be salvaged, that the mock-up could be repaired, that the intelligence was still valuable even if incomplete. But by mid-1987, the momentum was gone. The fire had killed the project as surely as it had killed the 5 men inside the hangar. Moreover, by that point, it was becoming increasingly clear that the intelligence the Soviets had gathered on the VC-25 was deeply flawed. Some of the specifications were outdated, based on early design phases that had been revised or abandoned. Some were outright fabrications, the result of American counterintelligence feeding false information to suspected sources, and some were simply misinterpreted. Technical jargon misunderstood or translated incorrectly by analysts who didn't have the expertise to evaluate what they were reading. The realization that they had wasted over a year and significant resources, not to mention 5 lives, on a project based on bad intelligence was demoralizing. The decision was made to abandon the mockup project entirely. The work stopped. The team was disbanded. The engineers and analysts were reassigned, many of them sent to unrelated projects far from Moscow, a tacit acknowledgement that the entire operation had been a failure that needed to be buried and forgotten. But the mock-up itself remained. It was too large, too damaged, and too compromised to be moved easily. Dismantling it would have required bringing in more workers, more equipment, and more attention, all of which would risk further exposure. So it stayed where it was, inside Hangar 19, covered with tarps, surrounded by debris from the fire, a ghost of a project that never should have existed in the first place. Over the years, the site became something of a legend within certain circles of Soviet and later Russian military and intelligence communities. People who had worked on the project, or knew people who had, would occasionally mention it, always quietly, always without details. Rumors circulated. Some said the mock-up was still intact, hidden and forgotten. Others claimed it had been dismantled in secret years ago. A few even suggested it had never existed at all, that the whole story was disinformation or exaggeration. But the hangar remained, and inside it, according to those who claimed to know, so did the mock-up. In the spring of 2004, nearly 17 years after the fire and 13 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a group of Russian aviation enthusiasts and urban explorers became interested in the old Zhukovsky airfield. The Cold War secrecy that had once surrounded places like this had loosened considerably. Many former military sites had been abandoned or repurposed, and it had become increasingly common for curious individuals to investigate them, documenting forgotten pieces of Soviet history. This particular group, reportedly 3 men in their 20s and 30s, had heard rumors about Hangar 19. They had pieced together information from former workers, declassified documents, and online forums where former military personnel sometimes shared stories. They believed that the hangar contained something significant, possibly related to an aviation project, and they wanted to see it for themselves. On April 22, 2004, they approached the site. The airfield was still technically restricted, though security had deteriorated significantly since the Soviet era. Some sections were abandoned entirely, others were used for storage or minor commercial aviation activities. Hangar 19, however, remained sealed and off-limits, its doors chained, its windows covered, and its perimeter marked with faded signs warning against unauthorized entry. The 3 men attempted to enter through a side access door. They had tools with them, bolt cutters and crowbars, and they were in the process of forcing the door open when they were confronted by security personnel. Exactly who these guards were is unclear. Some reports suggest they were private security hired by whatever entity nominally controlled the airfield. Others claim they were military or intelligence officers who had been monitoring the site. Either way, the result was the same. The 3 men were detained, questioned, and ultimately arrested. They were held for 3 days. During that time, they were interrogated about how they knew about the hangar, what they were looking for, and who had sent them. They maintained that they were simply hobbyists, curious about Soviet aviation history, and that they had no idea the site was still actively restricted or that their presence would cause such a reaction. Eventually, they were released without charge, but with a stern warning not to return and with their equipment confiscated. The incident might have ended there, another minor trespassing case in the long list of urban exploration gone wrong, except for what happened next. On the night of September 17, 2004, approximately 5 months after the attempted break-in, Hangar 19 burned to the ground. The fire started in the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m., and by the time local firefighters arrived, the entire structure was engulfed. They made no attempt to enter. There was nothing to save. The building was fully involved, the roof collapsing, the walls beginning to buckle inward. By dawn, there was nothing left but a charred foundation and scattered debris. Whatever had been inside the hangar was gone, reduced to ash and twisted metal. The fire was so intense and so complete that investigators had difficulty determining what had been stored there in the first place, let alone what had caused the blaze. The official explanation was spontaneous combustion, possibly due to old chemicals or fuel stored improperly in the abandoned building. It was a plausible explanation, the kind of thing that happens at derelict military sites all the time. But the timing was suspicious. 5 months after someone tried to break in, 5 months after those 3 men were arrested and questioned, the entire structure conveniently burned down, eliminating any evidence of what might have been inside. Rumors spread quickly. Online forums where the 3 men had discussed their plans erupted with speculation. Some users claimed the fire was deliberate, an effort by Russian intelligence or military authorities to destroy whatever remained of the VC-25 mockup before anyone else could find it. Others suggested it was a coincidence, that the hangar had been slated for demolition anyway, and the fire simply accelerated the process. A few even theorized that the fire was set by the men themselves, either as revenge for their arrest or to destroy evidence that might have implicated them in something larger. But no investigation was ever made public. No arrests were made. No official statement was issued beyond the initial fire report. And within a few months, the story faded from public attention, buried under the constant churn of news and speculation that characterizes the internet age. The site was eventually cleared. The burned remains of Hangar 19 were bulldozed and removed. The land was leveled. And today, if you visit the old airfield near Zhukovsky, there is nothing to indicate that Hangar 19 ever existed, let alone what it once contained. So what really happened? Did the Soviets actually build a mock-up of Air Force One? Was it destroyed in the 1987 fire, or did it survive in some form until 2004? And if it did survive, was the 2004 fire an accident, or was it a deliberate act to ensure that whatever secrets remained in that hangar would never come to light? The evidence, such as it is, suggests that the mock-up project was real. Multiple sources, including former Soviet intelligence officers who spoke anonymously in the years following the Cold War, have confirmed that such a project existed, that it was located near Zhukovsky, and that it ended badly, with deaths and significant damage. The details vary from account to account. Some say 5 workers died, others say more. Some describe the mock-up as nearly complete, others as barely begun. But the core story remains consistent. The 1987 fire is also well documented, at least within the limited records that have been declassified. Soviet military archives contain references to an industrial accident at a restricted facility near Moscow in March 1987, with multiple fatalities. The location matches, the timing matches, and the level of secrecy surrounding the incident matches what you would expect from a classified intelligence project. The 2004 incident is harder to verify. The 3 men who were arrested never spoke publicly about what they found or what they were told. Online posts from that period, preserved in archives, confirm that such a group existed and that they were interested in the hangar, but their identities remain unknown. The fire itself is a matter of public record. Local news outlets reported a blaze at the old airfield in September 2004, but there was no follow-up, no investigation announced, No official explanation beyond the initial report. What we're left with is a story that sits in that uncomfortable space between documented history and conspiracy theory. There are enough facts, enough confirmed details to suggest that something significant happened at Zhukovsky in the 1980s, and that something equally significant happened there again in 2004. But there are also enough gaps, enough missing records and unanswered questions to make it impossible to say with certainty what that something was. If the story is true, if the Soviets did attempt to reconstruct the VC-25 based on stolen intelligence, what does that tell us? On one level, it's a testament to the lengths that intelligence agencies will go to during periods of geopolitical tension. The Cold War was defined by espionage, by the constant effort on both sides to penetrate the other's secrets, and this would be just one more example of that dynamic. One more operation that succeeded in collecting intelligence, but failed in making use of it. But it also highlights the inherent difficulty of intelligence work, particularly technical intelligence. Stealing secrets is one thing, understanding them is another. The Soviets collected a massive amount of information on the VC-25 program, but without context, without the ability to verify or cross-reference that information, it was nearly useless. They built a mock-up based on bad data, and when that became apparent, they abandoned it rather than admit the failure publicly. The 2004 fire, if it was indeed deliberate, suggests that even decades later, even after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, there were still people who believed that the evidence of that failure needed to be destroyed, whether out of embarrassment or security concerns or simply a desire to close a chapter that should never have been opened in the first place. Someone decided that whatever remained in Hangar 19 could not be allowed to be discovered. There are still questions that may never be answered. How much of the VC-25's actual design did the Soviets manage to steal? Was any of their intelligence accurate, or was it all contaminated by American counterintelligence? If the mock-up had been completed, would it have provided the insights Soviet intelligence hoped for, or was the entire concept flawed from the beginning? We also don't know what happened to the people involved. The 5 workers who died in the 1987 fire were never publicly named. Their families were compensated quietly, and their deaths were recorded as industrial accidents. Nothing more. The engineers and analysts who worked on the project were reassigned, but where they went and what they did afterward is unknown. And the 3 men who tried to break into the hangar in 2004, who were they really? And what did they see, if anything, before they were arrested? Perhaps most frustratingly, we don't know what was actually destroyed in the 2004 fire. If the mock-up had survived from 1987 to 2004, 17 years sitting in a sealed hangar, what condition was it in? Was it still recognizable? Were there documents, blueprints, technical specifications stored alongside it? Or had it been stripped, dismantled, or simply rotted away to the point where it was unrecognizable? The fire destroyed not just the physical evidence, but any hope of answering these questions definitively. What this story illustrates, more than anything else, is the degree to which history, particularly the history of intelligence and espionage, is built on fragments, on partial records, and incomplete accounts. The Cold War generated millions of classified documents, thousands of covert operations, and countless secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. Some of those secrets have come to light in the decades since the Soviet Union fell. Archives have been opened, at least partially. Veterans of intelligence agencies have written memoirs or given interviews, at least about operations that are old enough to discuss safely. But many secrets remain. Many operations were never fully documented, or the documents were destroyed, or they remain classified even now, decades later, because the people who control them have decided that the world doesn't need to know. The VC-25 mockup project, if it existed, falls into that category. It's a story told in whispers and rumors, in anonymous accounts and archived forum posts, in the charred remains of a hangar that may or may not have contained what people claim it did. And perhaps that's fitting. Air Force One itself, the real one, is a symbol of American power and security, a visible representation of the presidency's reach and resilience. The idea that the Soviets tried to replicate it and failed, and then tried to hide that failure, is a kind of mirror image, a representation of the other side's desperation and limitations. Today, the VC-25 aircraft that sparked all of this are still in service, though they're nearing the end of their operational lives. The Air Force has already contracted for replacements, a new generation of presidential aircraft that will carry even more advanced systems and capabilities. Those planes are being built now, under even tighter security than their predecessors, and you can be certain that foreign intelligence agencies, Russian and otherwise, are trying to learn everything they can about them. The difference is that today's intelligence gathering is largely digital. Cyber intrusions, hacking, electronic surveillance, these are the primary tools now, not human sources sneaking blueprints out of factories. The methods have changed, but the goal remains the same: to understand your adversary's capabilities, to find their vulnerabilities, to stay one step ahead. Whether anyone will try to build a physical mock-up of the new presidential aircraft is doubtful. The lesson of the 1980s project, assuming the lesson was learned and remembered, is that such efforts are too resource-intensive, too difficult to keep secret, and too dependent on accurate intelligence to be worthwhile. But the impulse to try, to take fragmentary data and attempt to reconstruct something tangible from it, that impulse remains.